Thank you for your attentiveness and for your questions this morning. I often introduce the time together as I can talk for hours and never actually answer any of the questions that you have, that you came with. So the Q&A is a really important piece for me because it allows me to know what it is that your questions are and where your head is and what the stumbling blocks are for you. And we get to engage those together. So thank you for those vibrant questions that you asked as well. So this afternoon, we've got two pieces. The first, before I do that, I put on the table where the name tags were a piece of paper. If you'd like to be on my email list, please put your name and your email down there, and I'll add you to the list. And you can unsubscribe at any time, of course. But really, seriously, with the review, I hardly send out anything because I'm really working on that most of the time, and my creative energies have been seriously compromised as a result of that. So I'm not going to overwhelm your inbox, put it that way, but I would love to stay in touch. So please put your name and email address down there if you can. So we're going to talk about babies and bathwater, and what are the crucial things with which we need to move forward, that if we lost them, we would no longer be about the work that we are about. And if we do that, if we lose that, and what is so important and crucial in this undertaking is lost, then I think that there's much that will be lost, not just to those people who are in the church or who are toying with the idea of church or who have left the church, but for our communities, our larger communities as a whole, for our governments and the leadership in those governments, for the future of the world, which is at risk of anything at any given time. Not that it's going to disappear. I mean, life will go on long after we are all gone individually, and probably long after we as a race are no longer here. But how do we, I put it this way sometimes, and it's a bit apocalyptic, but if we go down, if humanity exhausts itself, how do we want to go down? Like, what is it we want to be to one another as we go down? And that's important to me, that we consider that, and that we choose to go down in ways that embrace everything that life can be on the way down. So that's part of the work that I'm about. And I was just invited to speak about eco-theology, and I don't have a lot to say about it because I have other things to say, but one of my biggest laments is my inability to impact or stave off some of what's coming. But in the past few weeks, even, I have met people who are doing the most amazing pieces of work, and they have given my heart hope, which it hasn't had for a long time. And if you want to ask me about anaerobic digestion later on, I'm happy to tell you what that's all about. So, okay, I'm going to ask you if you'd call out some answers just from where you are. No one can see who you are. I can barely see who you are, so it doesn't matter. But if you would call out an answer or an end to this sentence, when I use the word God, I mean the mystery, the order of the universe, love, source, energy, everything, life, values. That's quite an eclectic thing. None of you said a supernatural being who lives in another realm and intervenes in human affairs. Didn't hear that. Okay, so if you were going to be telling in your day-to-day engagements, how many of you actually talk about Jesus? 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, some of you do. For those of you who do and who do not, when you think about Jesus, Jesus is what? Friend, Son of God, prophet, love, master, teacher, rabbi, role model, human, regular guy with a message. So again, some breadth there of understanding as well. And if you were going to say in one word what the purpose of Christianity was, you would say transformation, community, love, justice, following Jesus, wholeness, mission, control. Something about the way over here? Teaching the way. Oh, non-empire, right? That's very Dom Crossan, the work that he has done has really lifted that up. Okay, so those are, I just want to put those out there because I think that we all have different ideas and different thoughts, but we very rarely share them. Maybe in a community like this, you feel comfortable sharing those ideas, but we don't usually share them widely beyond the safe confines of a group like this that comes together to actually talk about these things. And so when we use those words, or when we mention that, when we talk about Christianity, or if we mention Jesus in conversation, or we use the word God, we, without explaining what it is that we mean, we are subject to the interpretation that the other person holds. So as long as you use the word God, if it doesn't matter what their belief in that is, you are meaning that to them unless you actually describe what it is that you believe. So that's where we're going this afternoon, is how we have coped with some of the realities of coming to understand that. So I'm going to give you just a background to how I ended up where I ended up. And it started in 1997 when I began at West Hill United Church. I was the only called female minister in that section of Toronto at the time, which was a bit shocking in 1997. There was another woman who was appointed temporarily, but I was the only female in ministry. And for the first couple of years that you're in a church, you really lay low a little bit about presbytery because you got to know your congregation. You've got a lot of work to do in the congregation. So I didn't actually step in and offer to participate in presbytery, make myself known to the nominations committee until 1998, actually, about a year and a half after I got there. And of course, the nominations committee had a vacancy in incoming chair of the presbytery, right, which was really not what I was looking for. I thought maybe a few years on the stewardship committee or something. Anyway, so I ended up as the incoming chair of the presbytery, which meant I was there for a year, then I chaired the presbytery for a year, and then I was there as the outgoing chair of presbytery. In that year, as incoming chair of presbytery, and I'd been on presbytery before in a leadership role in another presbytery, I experienced some of church at its worst. We were engaged in a litigious situation with a clergy person who was being disciplined and removed from his pastoral charge. And we were not to speak about anything that happened. It was all confidential. I did meet my current lawyer in that undertaking, which was probably a good thing. But it really tore the presbytery apart. There wasn't a nice feeling about presbytery at all. And a lot of relationships had been not just broken, they'd been torn. Like there was a lot of scar tissue there. And a lot of open wounds still. So when I became the chair, I decided that my role and the most important thing that I could do would be to bridge those relationships. So instead of keeping all the work in the executive, I pushed the work out to the court so people would have to be there to have conversations and be part of it. But I also put together a program that I and the then incoming chair took to every single congregation in the presbytery, except for a couple who didn't want to experience it, just to build relationship, just to say, we're normal people, we do this kind of stuff too, and let's have a conversation. So I took a piece of work that the United Church had developed, and we used that to go around to congregations. And it was a workshop on core values and core beliefs. And if you've ever tried to schedule a meeting with one or two congregations, you know that it makes sense that to get around to 22 conversations, it took us 2 years to do that work. So by that time, I was the outgoing chair of the presbytery. But I and the incoming chair started as I was the chair, and we went around to each of the congregations and did this program. And it really set up It would set up scenarios. This is, in this situation, what would you do? And people needed to talk and come up with their responses. And we were getting at what their beliefs were, which was actually shocking. Because at the end of it, when we sat down, what we realized was that despite the fact that we were both educated in progressive liberal seminary theology, most of the people, if they had not themselves had theological training or had not worked at another level of the church that had put them in relationship with people who had higher education when it came to theology, they had very elementary understandings of Christian beliefs. So they couldn't really talk about God. God was, God, sort of. And Jesus was, their savior, but they couldn't articulate what exactly Jesus was saving them from. And they had ideas about heaven and hell, and no real understanding of how the world fit in between those two things, or our lives fit in between those two things. So we were gobsmacked, quite frankly, because both of us, as most of our colleagues, preached a very progressive understanding. Like we engaged the biblical texts, we brought progressive thought to them, we parsed them. Every Sunday, I would pick a piece from the lectionary. Everyone knows what the lectionary is. It's a selection of texts that are offered to congregations. There's a Roman Catholic one, and then there's one for Protestant denominations as well. And it's the texts are chosen by an ecumenical group of leaders to represent the major themes in the Bible. And there's 3 years of them, and you work through A, B, and C years, and then you start over again. And there's usually 4 texts, sometimes more, but it's a Hebrew scripture text, a psalm, an epistle, and a gospel reading. So when we brought our sermons to our congregations, we had explored, usually researched whatever the text was. We were able to do what we had been taught to do at theological college, and that was take it apart, find out what the political, and I mentioned earlier, socioeconomic situation was at the time, who wrote it, what the community wrote it for was, what the purpose of it was, how it fit into the development of early Christianity. And then I would explain why it was totally irrelevant to the 21st century, right? And then I would take something out of it and make it into a metaphor that I could use for them to take away. And that was usually the last 5 minutes of about 25 minutes of commentary. But what we learned was that no one heard any of that. Like, I put my heart and soul into those sermons. I spent hours preparing for them. I read more stuff than I ever wanted to read in order to put these pieces together so people would understand. And they weren't getting it. And Eilert and I kind of looked at each other and went, what? Like, what is going on here? Well, we had lunch. And that next Sunday, I went back and I sat down in the service and I opened the bulletin, and everything in that bulletin was consistent with a pre-Copernican universe, as Jack likes to put it. God as an interventionist supernatural being. The prayer responses were, "O God, in your mercy, hear our prayer. And for this, O gracious one, we give you thanks." Everything was held in that time warp of Christianity. And no one heard what I was saying, because as soon as I finished, they stood up and sang some triumphalistic hymn out of the hymn book, verses 1, 3, and 5, because 2 and 4 were just beyond what I was willing to let them sing. So we were reinforcing that ignorance, and I mean that word in its technical term. I'm not calling those people ignorant, but we had not done the work of helping them leave that stuff and move on. So my colleague decided that he needed to do something about this, and he wrote a study using the book of Acts and developed a study that was subsequently published by the denomination and sent out across the denomination. And the point was to teach people some of the progressive understandings and the progressive scholarship that, had happened between 1920 and 2000, right? And there was a lot of it. So he put that together in a study, and I simply went back and racked my brain for how I had managed to let this happen, right? And what was I going to do about it now that I realized the paradigm in which I was inviting my community members to remain by the way that we were doing the service. A couple of things happened subsequent to that that disturbed me greatly. One was that a colleague, while camping elsewhere in Canada, their campsite had been hit by a hurricane, and he had his 2-year-old son in his arms, and his son was torn from his arms and died as a result of that. And the next day, the headline in the newspaper had a picture of a family with their child, and the headline read, "God took care of our family." And I was so disturbed that I used language that could even remotely support that kind of a perspective that I undertook to, every time I saw that or heard it on the radio, I phoned the producer of the radio show, or I wrote the editor of the newspaper and said, we can no longer countenance that kind of language being used in that way. And I will not support you suggesting that one person is saved by God and one person is not. And one of the situations of that was a woman who had been missing was found in a snowbank in Toronto. She had been covered up with snow, and her husband is saying on the radio that God had put his hand down and held her safe. And the next story was about a 5-year-old dying in a house fire. And it was just, the juxtaposition was extreme and unsettling. So that happened, and I was concerned about that. So there were those two things. There was this outcome from this 2-year visitation program that we'd had, and there was that horrific situation which had happened to my colleague. And so these things were rubbing against each other in my brain. And one Sunday morning, when I didn't have a sermon ready, you know what that's like, right? Those of you who are clergy, it's too many, 4 weddings and a funeral, and you don't have a Sunday message. Only I don't have a drawer of them because I don't write them down. So I can't go and say, oh yeah, okay, Easter 6, here it is, right, I can do this one. So I end up in front of the congregation that Sunday asking that something happen, right? And something happened, and I completely deconstructed the concept of God that Sunday. I told the congregation I did not believe in the God that many of them felt I believed in, that I had not ever believed in that God. I took apart the supernatural aspects of God. I took apart the liturgical use of the word God. I took apart the interventionist and salvific understandings, and they were all sort of left in heaps around the congregation by the end of the service. And my congregation was so responsive, they thought I had totally lost it. And I had more hugs after that service than I had ever had because they were sure I was cracking up. But what I knew was that I had crossed a line. I had crossed a line. And so I needed to meet with my board because, although their letter inviting me to apply had said that they were ready to, travel new roads, I was pretty sure this wasn't it, right? So I met with them, and we sat around, and I shared what had compelled me to share that sermon, and they said, okay, what would it look like if we went in that direction and tried to create a community that, did not present the kind of God that you're reacting against? And I had to say, I have no idea. I wouldn't know what that looked like. There was nothing out there that I could say, oh yeah, so-and-so's congregation's been doing that for the last 18 years. Let's do that, right? So I didn't know. So I had to say, I don't know. And then I had to let them have a conversation without me in the room, right? They can't make any decisions without me there because no quorum if the minister isn't there. So they can't fire you unless you're part of the conversation. But I went back in and they said, okay, let's go. We want to see what it's like. We want to explore that. And as I said earlier, a lot of these people had studied this stuff in the book study, so they were comfortable with the ideas I was talking about, and they were ready to move in that direction. So that was, I think, a momentous occasion because I don't know, as someone mentioned this morning, the idea of talking. Oh, well, you were talking about ministers don't do it because of the money. I think it's more complex than that. That's certainly a big concern, but I think it's also that they're afraid they're going to hurt people if they undermine someone's worldview, and they care about those people, and so they don't want to hurt them. Clearly, I wasn't in either camp because I thought they were getting what I was talking about all along and had found out they weren't. So we began the process of trying to figure out what that looked like. And the first thing that we did is we decided to write a statement of faith, right? Because isn't that what you do if you're trying to, create a new way of talking about it? So we sat down, and the first thing that happened at that table, the very first thing out of someone's mouth was, well, it needs to say that the Bible isn't the authoritative word of God, right? It needs to say that. And someone responded to that individual and said, but wait a minute. Some people do believe that. And then the conversation was, what is the purpose of a statement of faith? And the purpose of a statement of faith is to identify who's in and who's out. And no one around that table was willing to do that. They wanted to create a space where people, regardless of what they believed, would hold to one another in community. So we ended up not writing a statement of faith. That was ditched the first day out of the gate. We brought in a number of different, Jack had a list. Who else had a list? The Center for Progressive Christianity had a list. I don't know. There were 3 or 4 lists that we brought. Oh, the Unitarian principles. We brought those lists in and we looked at them and we talked about them and we decided that none of them were really what we were looking for. What we wanted to do, we went back to the very earliest Christian communities who were called Christian as a derogatory term because of the way they lived, right? They went into places where people were sick and dying, and they risked stuff in order to be there, to be present to people there. They shared their food in these incredible, if you've read The Birth of Christianity by Crossan, these incredible communal meals where they would bring together people who had nothing to add to the table, but who had worked to invest in the community. And so they were welcome there, and then there was often a patron of the feast who provided most of what was being eaten, but it was a communal affair. And so we wanted to talk about being like that, being known for how we lived, how we were with one another. And so we wrote a document called Vision Works, which is on our website. It took us some time to do that document, and when we began introducing it to the congregation in order to elicit feedback and come to a final form, we led a series of, I would preach on one of the points, and then we'd have 2 follow-up gatherings during the week where people could engage and talk about it, and then we would send that back to the writing team, which would work that into a new iteration that had taken that into consideration. And the gathering that had the greatest number of people involved was when we were talking about leadership, and the piece of the document that came out was our leadership is shared. And so as an illustration of that, I brought all my stoles. I had a number of handmade stoles, each of which told a different story. The stole I was ordained in was a crazy quilt built on a story called The Parable of the Naked Lady, which I'll tell you at another time, in one of Rosemary Radford Ruther's collections of stories. And I placed them all on the communion table. And then during the service, as I was talking about the importance of our shared leadership, I would just take a stole and I would walk out in the congregation and put it on somebody's shoulders. And until they were all gone, right? And everyone was recognized as a leader. That Sunday, one of the children of a member of the congregation was playing the offertory on the piano. He was about, I don't know, 6 and was playing a grade 10 piece of piano something. Anyway, he was a phenomenal musician. So he was playing the offertory, and at the end of it, someone upon whose shoulders I had put a stole got up and walked over and put it on the child, right? And I thought, you have totally got this. Like, you have got this. So, but that was the one that had the most opposition from people in the congregation, because they couldn't understand, if I wasn't fully vested, how would anybody know who the minister was? And the argument was, if people don't know who the minister is by the end of this service, you know, we've got a serious problem. So we really sort of overrode that. But the whole process of working through that VisionWorks document was a healing process for the congregation, because we were able to tie together some of what that meant and make meaning of it, and set it down in community and have the community engage it, right? So it was a good process. I speak about my having had that conversation, that sermon when I just went out there. I speak about that as the moment that I became aware of what I talk about in With or Without God as the severing of the Corpus Callosum. Some of you will remember I talk about how the brain, you know, we've got 2 hemispheres, and one of them is a creative, artistic hemisphere. One of them is very language-oriented and very, you know, that's where your number stuff happens. And when I was at theological college, I was sharing with someone at noon that we were being introduced. You know, the United Church was a church of the Word. It was not a sacramental church. And so we listened to preachers in Geneva gowns because they were scholars, right? And so that's what they were explicating the Word for us, right? Well, when I got to theological college, it was in this sort of liturgical renewal movement, and we were beginning to take into our community a whole new sensual God, right? So we had colors, and we had candles, and we had dance, and we had smells. We had all kinds of stuff. And that was like the right side of my brain was orgasmic about that stuff, right? The left side of my brain was feasting on this academic background to what I understood to be the truth, that challenged it and morphed it and made me do something different. It fed that was orgasmic too, right? But I never connected the two of them. So when I was creating worship in very artistic ways, I didn't inform that artistic language and movement and work with what I knew on the left side of my brain. So those two didn't meet until that kind of crashing moment when I realized that the language I was using was getting in the way of people really understanding what I was saying. And I needed to sew the Corpus Callosum back together so that there would be some integrity to what I was doing. So that's really how we began that work. So once we had VisionWorks, we began the work of addressing some of the things in the service that weren't consistent with what we had said we were about. And that manifested itself when people came to us with a concern. We did not proactively go out and tear down the banners or, take the Bible out of the service. We didn't do that at all, although I did hide the Bible for a while. It was always back on the table on Sunday. I have no idea. I have my suspicions as to who did that, but it eventually was removed. But we really responded to the questions that people came to us with. And the Elements of Worship Committee, which is now just called the Elements Committee, would wrestle with that question, would take it to VisionWorks and determine whether or not we were able to continue with that practice, or whether we needed to set it in the historical record and move forward with something else. Almost always, we were convicted by the words that we had written, and we recognized that we needed to remove something from the service. So one of the examples is, subsequent to my arrival at West Hill, someone had asked me to have the children's time concluded with the Lord's Prayer. they felt that the children weren't really being exposed to it, didn't know it, and that it was important to teach them. So at the end of the children's time, each week, I handed the microphone to some child, because I always got the words mixed up, and they would lead the congregation in the Lord's Prayer. In 2004, parents of the children in the Sunday club approached me and said, "Why are you teaching our kids that prayer? Like, that does not reflect what we're doing in our gathering, doesn't reflect the kind of God, that we are constructing or engaging, and it's teaching them an idea of prayer, an interventionist idea of prayer, which we don't support. So we want you to stop." Okay, yeah, I'll do that. So it was a year before I actually had the courage to address that. And my husband, who you will hear later, is a songwriter. He has a lot of understanding of the metrical value of words and how they move. So over the course of Lent in 2005, we introduced what we now call the words of commitment. Then we called it the children's prayer. And I think it's in With or Without God. I'm fairly certain it's there. But we introduced it during those weeks. And while I was introducing it, we did it one line at a time so that we could feel one or two lines at a time. So we could feel the rhythm of it when it was being said by a large community of people, and tweaked it a little bit, and then eventually had the whole piece together. And one of the things that we did around that, which is important when you're doing any kind of substantial change like this, is to make it feel very much like something people recognize and resonate with. So we built on the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, who never heard of that prayer, because it wasn't written until the early 20th century. But it's attributed to him because it first was published on the back of a little card with his picture on it, right? So we don't know who really wrote it. But we started with that because it felt familiar to people in the church. But we changed it so it's not "make me a channel of your peace." It's "may I be a channel for peace." So the words go, "As I live every day, I want to be a channel for peace. May I bring love where there is hatred, and healing where there is hurt, joy where there is sadness, and hope where there is fear. Wherever possible, may I choose to be." I missed a whole separate section in the middle. "I pray that I may always try to understand and comfort other people, as well as seeking comfort and understanding from them. Wherever possible, may I choose to be a light in the darkness, a help in times of need, and a caring, honest friend. And may justice, kindness, and peace flow from my heart forever." So that has become, it's taken the place of the prayer that I only ever called the disciples' prayer, not the Lord's Prayer, and has completely been accepted by the congregation. And it's used around the world, actually, in a number of places. It's used in congregations in Scotland. It's used in Australia. It's used in many places in the States. And it's a welcome piece. I had a call from an email from a grade 2 teacher who wanted to know if he could change the words to it. And I thought, no. Like, that took us a long time to figure that out. Anyway, so I called him, and doesn't he answer on the phone and go, "Hey, kids, it's Gretta Vosper." And they're, "Yay!" Right? "Can we talk privately?" So I had a little chat with the kids and then arranged to speak to him privately. Well, the children had come forward with some ideas about how it could be improved. They didn't want to have the word hatred there. They thought that even just using that word invited it into the space, and it didn't. So they had asked for those changes. So by the time I had finished the conversation, it was absolutely, And he had contacted me early on, like years before, and had asked me if he could use it with his classroom because there was a lot of bullying happening in the school. So he'd been using it to open the day every single day for years. So it was just a beautiful moment about that. So it has gone on for that. However, during that season of Lent in 2005, we felt the tensions in the congregation just ratchet themselves up incredibly. people had lost a lot of things over the course of the years coming up to that. It had been about 4 years that we'd been working on it. And they felt that something that was very sacred to them was going to disappear. So we did not remove it from the service. We moved it to the end of the community prayers and left it there. So the children didn't actually engage with it, and the children didn't say it. Another story about the words. A parent in the congregation was a friend of hers who doesn't come to church, who has children her kids' age, had been telling her children about the work of Stephen Lewis, who is a well-known Canadian who does a lot of very positive work in the world. And she was talking about him and how important he was. And she said, you know, I have this prayer that I want to read you that Babette gave me. So she went to the fridge and pulled the prayer off and read it to her children. And her kid says, oh, I know that. And she goes, well, no, you couldn't know that because it's just at Babette's church. And he said, no, Kaylee taught me that at school the other day. One of the children from West Hill had shared that with another child in the schoolyard. And I thought, when was the last time a kid shared the Lord's Prayer with someone in a schoolyard? Like, that was a profound moment for us when we knew that it was so important to children that they felt it was a good thing to share with their peers. So that was sort of a moment that was very good. But we did eventually get to the place where we needed to talk about the Lord's Prayer remaining in the service. Because we were hearing over and over again from people who said, we got to take that out. It doesn't reflect who we are. I don't want it. It upsets me every time it's introduced. Every Sunday I feel excluded from the service. And we were hearing that over and over and over again. And of course, my pastoral response is, you know, if that's a pastoral response. But it was the last thing I really wanted to do, was to enter into this conversation. But the noise was getting louder and louder. So I began leading it. I'd walk into I'm in the middle of the aisle, and I'd say, so for those of you for whom these words have meaning, I invite you to join with me as we say together, our loving God. I did not change that. That was my predecessor had changed that part. Our loving God who art in heaven, and people would join in, and we'd say the prayer together. And they said, well, that's not good enough. So you need to tell people that they don't have to say it. They still feel they have to say it, even though you're inviting people to not bother. And so I said, okay, for those of you for whom these words have meaning, I invite you to join with me. And for those who would rather not say it, I invite you to think of a favorite song or poem or something that has meaning for you. Well, I got phone calls and emails that it was just a blatant disclaimer, and it was problematic, and people were unhappy with that. So I said, okay, I will just witness to the fact that people don't have to say it. Okay, so catch the optics of this. The minister is in the middle of the aisle, and she says, for those of you for whom these words have meaning, I invite you to join me. Our loving God. Nothing, right? As soon as I did that, I thought, oh, this is not good. This is not good at all. So the next week it was out. The Elements Committee and I decided that we were no longer going to share that piece, that liturgical piece, in our gathering, because it was more offensive for me to shut up and not say it than it was for us to just not say it ourselves. So we did try to engage in the conversation about the difference between personal devotional time and corporate devotional time. You know, what we do in our private, personal, spiritual practice, it can be anything, like whatever is important to you. But what we do corporately needs to reflect what we identify in vision work. So we did shift it. And that's really the moment when we tanked out a lot of people, right, in the congregation. And I said 75% earlier. That's probably it. Certainly in terms of finances, it was 75% of our bottom line that we lost. Most church finance graphs go like this, right? We lost 5 of the 6 families in the top donor category, which was like 80% of our donations. So we lost an incredible amount of that. We were a fragment of what we were to begin with. before that happened. I have some suspicions about some of that. But I think some of the reasons that people left, it wasn't the Lord's Prayer. I mean, it wasn't that. That was the excuse. But the reasons that people left, and I think that there are two of them. One is around how people get into that place where they can explore what we would call their spiritual lives, where they can talk about those things that are so intimate that you just don't bring it up at the dinner table with somebody that you're meeting for wings and on wings night, right? It's deeply intimate stuff. In the 1990s, we had gone through the process, most of the United Church, but not all of them, had gone through the process of closing the portal that invited people to get to that place through gender-exclusive language. And we said, we're no longer going to use gender-exclusive language in our community. And we closed that portal. So if that was the only way that someone got into that important place, if they could no longer be spiritually nurtured in that community, they found another community. And we did. We lost a lot of people in the United Church around gender-inclusive language. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that reality as well. But we were opening up portals that allowed other people to get into that space, who had felt that the gender-exclusive language was preventing them from being whole in their exploration of that realm of themselves that often was beyond words, but putting these words on it really shut them down. So we were opening up alternate portals. What we did through this process was we closed the theistic portal, right? So people who got into that space through the theistic portal no longer felt that they could find that space in our community. So they wanted God as a language, as a theistic being. They wanted that grounding that they got in that being, and we weren't providing it anymore. So they found a place that did, right? And my responsibility as a pastor, not many of them asked me for this, but my responsibility as a pastor was to help them find a spiritual home. If somebody's not being nurtured in this community, why would you require that they stay or try to talk them into staying? The most important thing is that they be spiritually nurtured in whatever way that's going to do the best work. So many of them left and went to another local congregation. Some of them left that when they found out the minister was gay, which was unfortunate. But they found other homes. And someone once said to me, well, it's not like they can't find some place where, they worship Jesus, right? Like, because every other church in the neighborhood is going to be offering that. So, it was a difficult time. But that was one of the major reasons. The other major reason, and I mentioned this in conversation last night, was grief. It's extremely difficult for anyone who has not resolved some of the grief issues around the death of someone that they loved, with whom they were in partnership, or who was had a deep presence in their lives. It's very difficult if they are counting on being reconciled with that person after death. It's very difficult to take that away from them or to suggest that it's not the case, right? So a lot of people were good until I said, I don't know what happens when we die. And that, it let loose that tether, and people felt they couldn't be there anymore because I wasn't promising them that. And I absolutely understand that. I also know that they are being cared for in the way that they need to be cared for in another place, which is good. And I mean, if we were able to do it, pastors would be shifting and moving people around all the time, because our biggest concern is their hearts. It's not the bottom line. It's made to be one of our biggest concerns. But if we were flush with resources, we would be moving people around. What about Sue? Do you want to take Sue? Okay, not Sue. Sorry about that. Not Sue. Do you want to take Sue? Okay, all right, I'll take Jeffrey, okay? Yeah, Jeffrey would be much happier here. Like, we'd have those conversations, and people would find places where they would flourish. And that's an important thing to us, is that flourishing. So, two of the things that I've heard since I came out with this work publicly, with the publication of With or Without God, is the one that we're talking about now. You can't throw the baby out with bathwater. And the other one is, well, you're just setting up a straw man God. You know, none of us believe in that God. So, you know, you're just setting up a straw man argument and then knocking it down, right? So those are the two things. So I wanted to talk about what the implications of our progressive thought is. And I was going to have some of this on PowerPoint. If some of you want to connect with me later, I can send you the slides with that information on it, particularly the students. You might want that. I'll give them to you. But I neglected to bring the stick. So progressive perspective, we talked about it being open, being passionate, creative, and intellectual rigor. Well, there are other things about a progressive perspective that you need to hold to if you're going to be able to move it forward. The first one is you need to be honest. You can't learn about something. You can't come to understand something in a new way and not be honest about what you know, right? I think that's crucial and important. And I think that some of that gulf between the pulpit and the pew has been maintained by using I'm going to forget the phrase that my husband talks about all the time doing his doctorate in this work, where you stretch the meaning of a word over something else in order to include it, right? And so the word God, rather than meaning, you know, what the Bible might describe God to be, you stretch it over nature, or you stretch it over the myriad of responses that you had, right? None of which would be traditional, really. Few of them were. But you stretch it over that stipulative redefinition. That's what it's called. So if you're being honest that you don't believe in that previous construct that once you did or maybe never did, and you learn that the language that you're using suggests to other people that you do believe in that, then you don't explain to them what stipulative redefinition is and that you've done that. And so it really, when I say the word God, it doesn't really mean God. When I say the word, you know, germ, it doesn't really mean germ. Or if I say the word Chesterfield, it doesn't really mean Chesterfield. It could be like, anyway, you get my point. It's not helpful. You have to be honest about what you mean by that word. And I believe that that's why I'm under fire from many of my colleagues, because they're very comfortable in the constructs that they have come up with. And, you know, go for it. If everyone in your congregation knows that's what you mean, absolutely, you know, head on out, right? But for me, if I, you know, one of my colleagues who sort of has taken me down talks about language, and she once spoke about the Trinity at a it was a symposium on what was our new draft statement of faith. And she spoke about the Trinity, and she talked about how the Trinity is really about community. It's really about the way we relate, and it's about our compulsion to be together, right? And she spoke beautifully about it. And I knew I could do that too. I could come up with a meaning, and I could preach about anything. I could preach about the ascension in a way that you would be going, oh my gosh, that is so inspirational. I get that. It's not about Jesus doing this. It's about this thing in my life. And that word now has a totally new meaning. Yay. You all go out of the room and you now have a new understanding of ascension. And the next time I use the word, you'll be going, I know what she means by that, right? I got that, right? But if someone else comes in and they didn't hear that sermon, they think I'm talking about that thing that Jack always jokes about, you know, like, is he in orbit now? They think I'm talking about a physical ascension of the post-resurrection Jesus up to God, right? So how much of that do I want to allow? I need to be honest about what I believe. And if that honesty means I don't use language that I'm hiding behind, that's what it means. And so the next thing in a progressive perspective is that you need to be courageous. You can't change teaching methods. You can't introduce new medical technology. You can't open someone's mouth and start putting in a new dental device unless you're courageous and you're willing to explore with them what it is you're doing and why you're doing it and what it means, and go through all of that and be open with it. You know, next time I see somebody walking around with one of those blood generator, energy generator things, which I really don't think are on the market yet, I'll understand because I've read a whole article about it, right? But to just pop that in somebody's arm and not tell them why you're doing it would be a little bit weird. We have to be, if we're going to be honest about anything, we have to be courageous, because it's not enough to be honest within your own household and go out and pretend about something else that is important, especially something that is as important as the conversation about faith and what religion means in this world here and now. So you need to be courageous. And the next thing that you need to be is respectful. And it's amazing the number of my colleagues who think that I am a bitch, that I say horrible things about people's belief, that I have zero tolerance, that I put people down, that I will not listen to people, I will only talk over them. It is unreal, the number of my colleagues who believe that about me, none of whom have ever had a conversation with me. I often introduce, when I'm starting, I say, if at any time in this presentation you believe I am being disrespectful, please stop me and invite me to find another way to speak. If I can't convince you or invite you to see things a new way without being disrespectful, then I don't deserve to be heard. And so if we're trying to put forward a progressive perspective, it needs to be respectful. And I think that's probably one of the most important elements of this work. And that's why I try very hard to have integrity with that requirement. And the final one is you need to be balanced. And that's the story about the Lord's Prayer at West Hill. If you introduce this, what is the cost to the people? Are they ready for that cost? How can you introduce it so that there may be loss, there may be pain, but you're present to them in a way that can help them through it. You're not just bombarding them with stuff. I tell the story of a former member of my congregation who's now deceased, but he grew up on the prairies in Canada, and his father was a harness maker. He was the town's harness maker and a well-respected member of that community. And he was so excited about the automobile that he couldn't quell his excitement about the automobile, and he was constantly talking it up, and he lost his entire livelihood because of the automobile, right? Because no one needed a harness anymore, or they might need one every 5 years instead of one every 6 months, right? Or they didn't need any repair. So how do we present what it is we're presenting, respecting what has gone before, allowing it the time to make the shift, and be present to them throughout that? That's an important piece. So what are the implications of that to the church? They are huge, and I'm going to talk about them, and this is where we get into too much information, but I'm going to try to share with you and invite you to think about what the implications of this are. And you can go home tonight and take a blank piece of paper, and you might write down some of the things I've said, but you might also come up with your own things, like what's the impact of this? And what am I going to lose in the process? Or what are the people that I'm in conversation with going to lose if I expose what I believe to them? So if we acknowledge that the findings of scholarship establish the human authorship of the Bible, right, and critical scholarship, that's where it ends up every single time, is the human authorship of the Bible. So what does that do? Well, the claims that have said to be authoritative because they're divinely given, right? God mandated this, are no longer divinely given. They're human constructions, and we have to acknowledge they're human constructions. And if they're of human origin, then they aren't really any more authoritative than anything else that we've come up with in our time, right? So We may talk about values. This is a better thing because the values are different than this one, and those values aren't quite as stellar. But we can no longer claim that this is the right thing because it's divinely authored. We lose that. So you lose, a standing platform that we've built the church on, right? And that loss is huge. We need to be aware of it. So anything that is written or created by humans is open to human critique, right? And not just the way I happen to see it, but the way you see it too. You could come up with critical arguments that I've never thought of, but because it's of human origin, yours are just as valuable as mine. Your book list is probably bigger than mine, and you've come up with this perspective. So we are humans, and we will critique it. We have to judge them according to their adherence to the life-enhancing values that we want to live by, right? How do you want to live? How do you judge that in relation to this? That's an important part of it. And so I come back to the question of honesty. Given that the Bible is a human construction, if you embrace that understanding, how are you honest about that? Do you continue to privilege it as the only text that's read from on Sunday mornings? Or do you lift other texts up as well? People always like to hear that we've read from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Doctor Who, but we've also read from, Mary Oliver and Charles Dickens, and we read poetry by Charles Bukowski. We read all kinds of stuff that bring to the community tensions that need to be explored, because we're human beings, that we will always be in tension with the world around us. So let's explore that in a creative way and be honest about where we're placing the Bible. Right before I arrived at West Hill, thankfully, someone dropped the Bible and broke the cover. So I didn't have to deal with the fact that they processed the Bible down the aisle every Sunday. Instead, I just had it on a stand on the communion table, and it eventually disappeared. I wasn't the one who finally removed it, but people recognized that we needed to question that. So it means also moving beyond the constructions that we have created, each of us in our own denominations slightly different from another, but the constructs that we have that adhere to supernaturally sanctioned sources, right? So if our liturgies, if our hymns, if our ecclesial behaviors are tied up in an interventionist supernatural being, which is endorsed in the Bible and only the Bible, and the Bible is a human construction, then we have to untangle ourselves from that. How do we deal with that? How do we be honest about that? And that's that. I mean, we're talking about, what are we talking about? We're talking about baptism. We're talking about reading the Bible. We're talking about communion. We're talking about passing the peace. We're talking about most of our hymnody. I mean, all of that comes into question. And then I get back to that list. What does courage look like? How do you stave up your pastor when she or he has decided, okay, I'm going to introduce this stuff? How are you present to them? Are you, whoa, no, Mrs. Anderson is going to be out of here if you do that. Or are you, okay, I'll go and talk to Mrs. Anderson. I'll engage with her, and we'll walk together with her and help her figure out how to find a new way of being together. It's honesty and it's courage. We have to move beyond constructions that use language that excludes on the basis of gender, which we tried to do in the 1990s at great cost. Sexual orientation, race, gender, everything, all of that stuff, we have privileged that based on a book that privileged certain constructs, right? And now we recognize that group of people back then, who weren't even a group, they were just a bunch of individuals all over the place. Those people who wrote that had their own understandings of what was human. And it didn't include women most of the time, let alone people that weren't of the same race or sexual orientation as them. So if you want to broaden that, because that's a human construct, you get to broaden that. That's not a fault. That's a privilege to be able to move beyond those constructs into things that no longer exclude. We get to move beyond those things that are just so archaic that no one even knows what they mean anymore, right? Like, of the Father's love begotten. Does anyone know that hymn? Of the Father's love begotten. Da, 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 da. 3rd century theology. Yep, 3rd century theology. Most people don't know that that came out in the controversies that were erupting in the church that led to some of the creeds being created in the 4th century, but it was addressing the Arian heresy, that song was. Well, why on earth are we talking about the Arian heresy? Like, the music is beautiful. I've rewritten the words, but yeah, it's archaic, it's obscure, it's specialized. It doesn't make sense to most of the people in your pews, right? They may love the song, they may love the music. Give them back the music. The music, we have people, guests at West Hill all the time, and we have a lot of music that Scott, my husband, writes, sort of in a contemporary Christian style, but both of us rewrite words, or we write new words to traditional hymns. We used to change traditional hymns that were in the public domain, but we've realized that it's harder for people to change a hymn than it is for them to just sing something new. So mostly we write brand new words to hymns. And we often have people who can't sing them because they're in tears, because they've been given back a song that they can't sing. And so the resonance is with the music. It's with the feeling of sharing that music in a group. It's rarely with the theology in verse 3, right? Like, it's not. It's about the experience of singing in a group. And when we came over from the cafeteria, we had the military people singing as they moved along. You know why they do that? Because singing is one of the strongest human bonding exercises that you can do. So it takes those individual recruits and it turns them into a troop of people who will act in one accord, who will be there for one another, who won't desert and leave someone in a terrible situation. Bonding happens when we sing. And so singing in church and being able to be given back those songs is extremely important. And it also, it means that those unequal power balances that are sanctioned by the church, the priest or the minister and the lowly plebe who happens to sit in the pews, all of those are wiped out as well. And we have to figure out what that looks like. And what does it look like? And I go back, okay, so respect. What is respect? Let me give away all of my privilege and all of my authority so that I can sit with you and have a conversation. Is that not how our leaders should be? That we are on this journey together. I just happen to be trained and to be able to do this, but you can do something else. Let's have you do that, and I will learn from it and be better because of it. You get away from those sanctioned imbalances. So applying progressive thinking to the church means we have a lot to lose. If you lose the theistic God, you lose the idea of prayer, and we've talked about that. Who do we pray to? If you lose Jesus, you lose the salvific elements of the story, and that goes to every sacrament that you have or don't have, depending on what your denomination is. But there's nothing that we do that is a symbol of God's action in that moment, because that Jesus being the polarity that makes that happen is no longer real. And it takes the centrality of Scripture and completely removes it, the lectionary, the hymnody, everything that is based on that. And so that the question that we're left with then is that last question about progressive Christian thinking. How do we balance it in a way that allows people to come with us, that doesn't shut them down or close them out? How do we introduce to them that the story is rich and full and that it needs telling, and it needs telling in new ways, with language that is not wrapped up in that hierarchy or that document that we gave far too much power to for far too long. Those are the challenges that progressive thinking brings to the church. So that's really where I wanted to go. I wanted to say that when we talk about, when people say, aren't you throwing the baby out with the bathwater to them is the kind of liturgical stuff, right? Like, well, yeah, we can sing different hymns. But the baby is the idea of God, right? That's not what I think about when it's the baby in the bathwater. The baby for me is what those of you who have read With or Without God would know is Tawagfat, the authoritative word of God for all time. That's the baby, and we need to get rid of it. We need to move away from any belief that suggests that that book has any more authority than the next one when it comes to what might uplift us. When we read at West Hill, what we read, the only criterion for whether it can be read is if it is worthy of the people who gather. And if it is not worthy of them, it is not read. So there are parts of the Bible that are welcome in that space, and there are parts of the Bible that I will never allow to be read in that space while I'm there. So, excuse me. So that's really the baby in the bathwater. And I'll just say a few things about, a few things about the straw man God, because I get accused of that a lot, about just setting up this straw man God that nobody believes in, and I'm just doing it to, show off that I have this argument. But you know, more than we in Canada know, that straw man is alive and well and has incredible influence in the world, not just in this country and in a Christian culture, but in many countries, in many different iterations. And if you're going to tell me it's a straw man God, I want you wrestling with that God and seeing how quickly you can get it to the ground. And it will not be easy. The idea of a simplistic understanding of God that I have on my side that is reinforcing what I want to do in the world, that privileges me and me only, that is a very powerful God. And that God exists. And so if someone says you're just putting up a straw man God, my response is you're just hiding behind that argument, because that God does exist, and you need to start wrestling it to the ground as well as I do need to wrestle it to the ground. So that's the work that we're engaged with. So I hope that's been helpful, and we have some time for questions. Excellent. Thank you. So again, if we can do the Jack girl guy thing, that'd be good.
Go ahead.
It's after lunch. Everybody's tired. I know he's just holding the mic.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah.
My bad. All right. So first of all, let me say thanks for everything. I've been enjoying your anecdotes about how you've interacted with people in your church, and those definitely hold some valuable lessons for how I should interact with people through religious context. But I was curious about, maybe I'm lacking some context here because I have not read your books, but I was wondering, you believe in a metaphorical, a spiritual God, but what is it about Christianity specifically that appeals to you versus other religions or even philosophies that may, communicate these same sort of lessons through their stories, as if interpreted in that manner?
That's a brilliant question. Thank you. First of all, let me talk about what I believe. When I use the word God, what I mean. And when I used to use the word God, which I don't anymore, my understanding of God, as I shared this morning, grew up in a very different context than many did. But what it sort of came to be through my theological training was what we hold between us. And as individuals, we can enter into a relationship that we make sacred, it's a Martin Buber I-thou concept, that I can create a relationship with you that is one of beauty and trust and respect, and that uplifts you, and you uplift me. And that's beautiful, and that was my understanding of God, was that. So when I would say, or when we would talk about, coming close to God. It was finding those places where you had those relationships. God be with you, is let you find all of that power and energy in your life. And we are prone to user relationships, right? I'm going to have a conversation with you because I can get something out of it that I can use later on in my life. So thank you very much for that information. And that's not that wholeness that we look for in relationship, which I think is crucial. And I've been doing a considerable amount of meditation lately, trying to wean myself off guided meditations, but they have a place. And they often use the concept of the divine, right? They talk about the divine in these meditations. And when I hear that, I'm immediately transported to this image of each relationship we have being a relationship of light. I wear a candlewick bracelet that on the longest night of the year, everyone in the congregation gets given a candlewick bracelet and is told, you are the light of the world, right? And our responsibility is to be that light whenever we can. And when I build a relationship with you, it's a relationship of light. At least that's what I want it to be. So when I hear the word divine, I have this image of, you know, when you travel on an airplane and you look in the back and it has those pictures of where the plane goes to, right? Well, zoom in on that and think about all the connections between every town and then every block and then every individual. And each one of them being light. And it's like this, it's like the whole world is wrapped in this luminous reality because we've created it to be real. You can't put your fingers on it, and it's not, you don't find out about it in a book. You experience it. I think Teilhard de Chardin referred to it as the noosphere and Christogenesis. He spoke about Christogenesis. So that's what my understanding of God is. And now you know why I don't use that word, because if I use that word, no one has that picture in their head, right? Unless I tell them what it is. So the other part was why Christianity? Why is that the bedrock out of which I'm growing this offering, I guess we'll call it. And that's really because that's my story, right? That's the story I grew out of. And on Easter, our Easter service, we start on Palm Sunday. We call it Dream Away. And on Palm Sunday, we come in, and it's like the Thursday night before the crucifixion, and it's a party, man, because everyone, Jesus has come into Jerusalem. They're excited because this is the center, and it's like, you know, you guys want to get into Atlanta and get the word out in Atlanta. Well, he wanted to get into Jerusalem and get the word about his work out to the religious authorities in Jerusalem. So that sort of triumphal entry into Jerusalem, you know, depending on who you read and whether or not it really happened. But the story tells it because the hope was that there something enormous would happen. So I imagine that on Thursday night, they're like lying around the table, they're drinking it up, they're congratulating each other and having a great time. So we tell that story. We talk about people who have changed the world, who are incredible innovators in every area and who are making the world a better place because of that. And then we serve communion. And for us, communion is after the manner that Dom Crossan talks about it in The Birth of Christianity. The food is all in a separate room. We say what we're going to do, and people go and they bring all that food out and they put it in the center of our space, and we have a meal together. While everybody's enjoying the meal, I go up to the table, 15 minutes in, and I pull the tablecloth off, and everything goes all over the floor. And we talk about how it doesn't matter what your dream was. It doesn't matter if it was your law degree or your marriage or your first kid or moving to a new state. It doesn't matter what your dream was. You're always going to have it shattered. Like every dream we've ever had is vulnerable to reality. And marriage isn't everything it was cracked up to be. You might be on your second or third, or you may have given up altogether. And the job that you had has turned out to be a 9-to-5 grind that is wearing you down. And the law degree just means that you never see your children. right? Because you're constantly working. Doesn't matter what that dream was. It's gonna crack. Like you might be in the perfect marriage, and have perfect kids and be able to work from home. I don't know. Maybe all of your dreams have come true, but those big things that we dream about so often don't, right? So when I went on leave in March, my heart was broken because of my inability to affect the kind of change that would stave off climate change, right? Like personally, I'm really not responsible for that, but I was doing all of these little crazy things to make me feel like I was doing something. And I'm not doing as many of them now anymore, but it was heartbreaking that I couldn't do that. That was my dream. Let's stave that off. Couldn't do it myself. So we tear the room apart, right? And we name the people who have been murdered that year because they've been trying to change a system in Colombia or wherever they've disappeared. We talk about those systems that continue to grind people to dust. We lay all of that out, and that's it. They go home that Sunday with the place a mess and absolutely no sense of hope because I've destroyed absolutely every thread of it that they would possibly have. And then on Easter Sunday, they come in, and there's still a bit of the mess around. And in the course of that gathering, we tell stories that recommit us to that hope, that we can make a difference. And we'll pick up the pieces that were broken and put them back together. We've had people write words on a tablecloth one time, and I tore it to shreds. And then the next week, we came back and wove it back together. We've had tin cans thrown all over the place. And the next week, we've come back and they've been cut into stars and they've written their names of their heroes on them. And they hang from the ceiling now. Like that's my story. I just don't tell it the way we used to tell it. Yeah, sure.
The first point you made about, light or energy between all living beings, in my life, I just refer to that as spirituality or God or whatever, the universe. And that's how I see that. But for the latter, if you don't, it seems like your teachings are purely philosophical, not religious in nature. So it seems like you might be able to reach more people if you make yourself more accessible to not just Christians in particular, but people of all walks of life.
Yeah. And that's the next what I'm going to talk about later on is how we need to do that and how we might do that and some of the things that are happening that are doing that, because that is a significantly important thing. And people who have come to West Hill because they heard of what that community does, when we do that Easter thing, they have no idea I'm saying anything about Christianity. Like they have no idea, right? And the same at the longest night. Our longest night service is one of our sort of signature services, and people come to that. It's replaced the Christmas Eve service or the midnight mass at Christmas, and it's a powerful, beautiful service. And it talks about all the things that are part of that story for me, right? Because I grew up in it. But if they have no Christian background, they don't hear that. And that's absolutely fine. Like, that's absolutely fine. But yes, we are not saving Christianity. We won't save Christianity. Not that we wouldn't if we could, but we can't. So I think there's another chapter that needs to be lifted up, and that's an important piece of work that you need to do. Sorry, that was a very long response. Okay, we have a woman here. Mic is on its way. Thank you for that question.
Thanks. Just something that he said reminded me that I had a friend in college who used to attend the Ethical Society. And I don't know anything about that, but it sounds to me like there's some overlap, or
yes.
You might want to comment. But my second part of my question is, when you're away from your congregation, does your staff or other people, do they do sort of what you do, or do they have a different approach?
They pretty much do what I do. We are, as I return to work after being on leave, we're holding back 50% of my time just to deal with the logistics of the review. So we have guest speakers for 2 or 3 Sundays a month. I speak 2 Sundays a month. I lead the gathering. I'm the conductor each week, but someone else brings the message. We call it a perspective, and actually it goes up on the screen. It says perspectives with the S in a bracket, and the idea is I'm giving you my perspective. You get to add yours to it and share it beyond this place. So that's why we call it that. So yes, we do that. And then on the 5th Sunday, we've just introduced that on the 5th, whenever there's a 5th Sunday of the month, it's a TED Sunday. So we show a TED Talk and we have a conversation around tables because there's lots there that can be enlightening.
And the Ethical Society, do you want to say anything more about that?
I don't know a lot about them, but the Ethical and Humanist Society has been around for many, many years. There are chapters down around here somewhere. I can't tell you exactly where, but they do meet. And there are other organizations that are doing similar work to that as well. Many people ask me why I don't just become a Unitarian. There are some Unitarian sort of post-theistic Unitarian congregations that do not use theistic language, but most of them that I know of in Canada continue to use theistic language. So I would be an outlier in the Unitarian Church as well as I am in the United Church. So yes, but ethical and humanist societies are very, they're doing this kind of work of bringing together people and building community.
Thank you for being an outlier. You're very much of an inspiration to me.
Thank you. We had a gentleman here first, I think.
I'm Tolly Williamson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
What do you imagine it would take for the lectionary to include sources other than biblical sources?
An act of God. I don't know. I mean, that's people say, well, you're just, like you're taking Jesus away, and I say we're not taking Jesus away. We're not privileging Jesus anymore. So we're saying that what the record shows that Jesus said or did, whether he did or not, is not a question in this discussion. We're saying these people have also things to say that are worthy and valuable.
Right.
And so we lift them up. And the same with the Bible. There are some passages of the Bible that are absolutely worthy of being shared and others that are appalling. Mm-hmm. My husband put together for a study group one time the good things that God says in the Bible that are life-giving and the bad things that God says in the Bible. And these are not like the things that other people say that are nasty. And it's like this thick for the bad and like this for the good. Like there is so much that is negative, that is life-denying, that is condemning, that is harmful. And that's why I say if it's something that's worthy, it can be brought in. But when I was a student, I was at church one Sunday, and all of the lectionary readings were read, and one of the readings was the one on divorce, right? And that, and it was read, right? We read through all of them, and then the minister preached the sermon, didn't say a word about that. So that's just out there condemning anybody in that community who has left a relationship or has remarried or anything, including the minister who was preaching, but it wasn't addressed, right? So I think the lectionary is a dangerous one because it's selecting texts, and two, because no pastor really has the artistic wit to put all four of them together and address the problems as well as lift up the gifts inherent in it in any given sermon. So yeah, it would be really great. And I'm working on a resources project that would provide for people who wanted to do non-theistic stuff. Each week I read the scripture passages from the lectionary. I find a theme, I pull a theme out, then I go and find readings that will address that theme. Then I write resources that address that theme. And I'm trying to package that to be available. I've just had 3.5 years of a review, which has kind of got in the way of that creativity, I must say. So thank you for that. I think that would be an excellent.
One other question.
Sure, okay.
It has to do with the music that you mentioned. When you change the words to a song, what kind of copyright issues
Right.
would you have to deal with?
Absolutely. We don't change the words to any songs that are copyrighted.
Okay.
We only change songs that are in the public domain. Initially, we changed a lot of contemporary Christian songs because I assumed that, as in the hymnary, most of that music was not copyrighted with the text. So you could write different words to the music, and it wasn't a problem. Contemporary Christian music is copyrighted as a whole. So if any of you are clergy and you know how hard it is to teach a new song to your congregation, we taught about 25 new songs to our congregation and then had to put them all away because they weren't legal. So we had to get rid of them. So ones that we have rewritten or changed the words that are in the public domain, we sell them in a book called Sing It Forward, and they're, anybody has permission. I mean, they were in the public domain, so we encourage people to use them and change them if you want to. And I'm going to share some of Scott's music later on this afternoon. Any woman over here?
I'm very interested in the children's prayer that you spoke of, and you said you thought it was in one of your books?
Yes, it's in With or Without God. I'm fairly confident it's in the back of With or Without
Thank you.
God. Yeah. And it's available on our website too. Yes, you're the next guy. You have to put the mic by
It
your
seems
mouth.
like much of what you're describing is tearing down old traditions and trying to build new ones. Would you say that's a fair summary of what you've been trying to do? Because you took a foundation that, for instance, a scriptural foundation for a church, which is foundational for the Protestant group that I was raised in. Though a loving God and Jesus is your friend, to pull that out, you have to make a new foundation. And how are you still, I assume, still in process of building a new foundation with music, with things that people do together, and with sharing? Would that be your themes for that?
Yeah, I started laughing when you said that because when we wrote the original Vision Works document and when it was approved by the congregation, it needed to be reviewed every 5 years. So it's been rewritten twice, and I have not been involved with those rewrites at all. It's just been the congregation who's done that. But the first one, it wasn't until after it was written and printed and copyrighted by the congregation that someone read it out loud to me. And I mean, I'd been part of writing it, so I saw it there, but the first thing it said was, our foundation is spiritual. And I thought, oh my goodness, the foundation has always been biblical, right? The foundation for every Christian church is biblical. And we had rewritten that without me even being aware of what we were doing. So we made the foundation spiritual. Then in the next writing, everyone took the word spiritual out because they thought it was problematic. They also took out the word ministry because we had identified different ministries. In the third rewrite, they started putting that stuff back in because they thought, they had sort of cleansed it of all the negative stuff and they could put it back in. But yeah, really, what are we building on? And I'm going to talk about this in the next piece. So I'm going to invite you to wait for a little while, but I'll answer that about what we're building. Okay? You'll be back, I hope. Okay. All right. Shall we break? It's 2:30. We're good? Okay, thank you.